Hey, and welcome to the Rhythm Changes podcast. I'm your host, Will Chernoff, and this episode is sponsored by the free weekly email at rhythmchanges.ca. That's where I write to you every Tuesday morning, send you an artist, event, or recording from our local scene for you to enjoy and share. We're on our way to 1,000 people getting the free weekly email every single week. So if you're listening and haven't signed up yet, now is absolutely the time. We're going to have an awesome 2024 together. Sign up now at rhythmchanges.ca and get the free weekly email, and I will write to you every Tuesday.
There really are, in my opinion, the 4 A's is the way to judge whether a night is good. Attendance, atmosphere, obviously there's artistry, if the band is good. And the other, surprise, surprise, is alcohol sales, because that's how we survive.
All right, we are back with another new episode, this being the last one of 2023. It's been an awesome year with you here on the show. Thank you so much for joining me. Today, we have another venue booker. I've always enjoyed talking to the people who book the music at our venues in town. This is one of the most active ones. You could say it's one of the big 3 or 4 venues right now, but there's so much I don't know about the organizer of this venue's story. So bringing my conversation with him up next. Our guest today is a guitarist, singer, songwriter, actor, venue booker, leader of the Seven Tyrants Theatre Society, where they present above the historic Penthouse Night Club at Tyrant Studios. So please welcome to the Rhythm Changes podcast, Daniel Deorksen.
Hey.
How you doing?
I'm good. Yeah. Thanks for inviting me to do this.
Thank you for coming. The timing is awesome because I played at Tyrant just less than about 12 hours ago.
About 12 hours ago, yeah.
Which is pretty cool to be talking to you again right after that. So I had a fun time. Thanks for having us.
Yeah. Oh, my pleasure. It was a great show.
If I think back to the first time I ever set foot in Tyrant, it was, I think, January 2020. So this is before COVID. It's not the very, very beginnings of Tyrant, which I kind of want to learn more about. I realized how little I know about that.
Oh, yeah.
But that was the first time I played there, and it was the first time I was there. At that time, we played the Friday Jazz series that you still have today.
Yeah.
Was that the only night of music that you were presenting at Tyrant at the time? Was it a once-a-week thing on Fridays?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, Now how many nights a week are you doing of all kinds of entertainment?
Now we're 3 nights a week regularly, but we also have other stuff going on more irregularly. So,
well, congratulations to that.
Hey,
cheers
whatever.
to that.
Yeah. Cheers to that. Hey, we'll keep trying to grow trying to go and trying to grow as long as we can. That was that for Bill's show?
No, that Bill's show. This is the late Bill Moisey, who is an
how we
icon
met anyway
in the extended universe of Dan that I've come to know here. And we met because of Bill.
Yeah.
But this was the first time I just went to the space, Tyrant itself.
Oh,
I recall the very first time I met you was actually at my old rehearsal space, which was my mom's garage in New West. You and Bill came out there and you auditioned me for his band. Do you remember that?
Yes, I totally do. Yeah, I remember that because I remember we were looking for a bass player for that project, and I think both of our leads came up with nothing, but we had Gabrielle on that show already, and he was like, "Oh no, you should reach out to my friend Will." So yeah, we went and did that. And what I remember most about that is that you very quickly picked up the essence of all the material, but also I can remember you saying This is not one of the songs was not in A440 or whatever, right? Like you were like, is this in C sharp or is it in D? I can't remember, but we had recorded this demo for one of the tunes, and somehow we didn't discover till after the recording session that the tuner had been set to A450 something. Yeah, so we were playing that. So every time you try and play along to that song, it's always like, why is this recording sharp?
Yeah.
Anyway, and you had picked that up by ear, and I remember Bill being immediately impressed by that. So there you go.
That was the very first time we met. Yeah, it was for a project that Bill was doing, and you were working on with him at the Seashell Arts Festival. This was in the fall of 2019, so this was just before I played at Tyrant for the first time. That was the first time I encountered you. was around that music. And then I came up to Tyrant and played there. You were doing music one night a week. Tyrant had already been around for a year and a half at that point in that kind of state. Is that right?
Yeah, but pretty much a year and a half. Tyrant officially opened as Tyrant Studios in May of 2018.
Okay.
And we opened under that name at that time after we had already been sort of in residency in that and kind of had, begun the renovations and transformations of that upstairs space to be a little bit like an arts hub. And we sort of launched it that May. And we had, we actually did have 3 nights a week briefly at the very beginning because we tried out a regular Sunday night where we had Kurt, who, often works at Tyrant these days and one of our kind of founding producers, had kind of spearheaded a bit of an open mic night kind of thing that was around that first summer as well. So I guess technically there was sort of another music night. But what we kind of started it off with was Friday jazz, Saturday comedy, and then this kind of weird Sunday open mic thing. And the Sunday thing didn't really last through that first summer, but the Friday, Saturday things just kind of became the regular programming. And my other founding co-producer, David, he had sort of, we went to theater school together and started this theater company out of theater school. And ultimately it was kind of, us and this company that basically ended up putting Tyrant Studios together. And as you mentioned, our theater company is called Seven Tyrants Theatre Society. And so, big surprise, that's where you get the Tyrant Studios name.
Yeah, it's a nonprofit, right?
Yep, nonprofit. Yeah. Just your typical sort of small theater company, small arts society. But we are an award-winning company. We produce a bunch of plays, and a lot of them original plays over the years since we got out of theater school. And a lot of it, by the time the kind of early 20 teens had arrived, we had started, not exclusively, but we had started a bunch of work that was kind of site specific. We were doing a lot of found venue work. I think in some ways it's still kind of in vogue in the sort of local theater universe, but for a little while there in the kind of early 2010s kind of thing, there was like a real fashion for this sort of site-specific work, and people were exploring doing plays at different parks and different odd places, and we were kind of definitely sort of part of that wave for a little while. We did a lot of work out of the Classical Chinese Garden in Chinatown, Science World, places like that. And we ended up stumbling across the venue that's now Tyrant. I knew the previous manager there. We had worked together at the Vogue Theater back in the day. And so we would rent the upstairs, what's now Tyrant, which was, I kid you not, just like empty. There was nothing in there but boxes and cobwebs and a few old chairs. And we would rent it for rehearsal space. The sort of back room that's now our bar room was just sort of a big empty room, and we could kind of like, it could be a pretty adequate rehearsal room to rehearse plays in, and it was the price was right as well, kind of thing. So, and then in towards the end of 2017, we had decided that we wanted to do a production that year, but we didn't really have a lot of funding. We didn't really have a whole lot in the company coffers. We didn't want to let a year go by before we had another production. So we concocted this idea. It was actually my co-producer David who found this play that he really liked called A Steady Rain, which was kind of made famous on Broadway because the original production had, I believe it was Hugh Jackman and Daniel Craig in it. And if you look online, there's this weird viral video that came out of that original production, because one of these plays where the actors kind of talk to the audience in character, and they're kind of like, this is what happened to us, and this is what, and then they kind of act out some scenes, but there's a lot of breaking the fourth wall, talking right to the audience and kind of the character, and they're sort of playing these kind of rough Chicago cops kind of thing. And at one point in one of the New York productions of that, somebody's cell phone went off in the audience, and so there was a viral clip for a little while of Hugh Jackman like totally unloading on one audience member for their cell phone going off in the performance.
Oh boy!
But it was basically because he was in character as this cop. You know what I mean? Anyway, that play did really well on Broadway and stuff, and we decided to stage a version of it and play the roles ourselves. And we hadn't been on stage together in years. We've been doing mostly like producing, music directing the plays, a lot of occasionally appearing on stage, but not really together. So it was this interesting thing where we were like, okay, it's like a two-hander play. We'll get together, we'll play the roles of these two cops, which has also got a bit of a, I don't know, what do you call that, Mutt and Jeff kind of thing going on, because my co-producer David is like a big guy, like he's a tall guy, and like, I don't know if anyone listening has not seen me, but I'm not a tall guy. So it's like we had this kind of neat sort of dynamic that was a little bit, hysterical in its own way in the midst of this dark play of these two kind of partners on the force that were very physically quite different. And then once again, Kurt was in there as a kind of providing a live soundtrack to that. He played the saxophone and the piano as kind of like a live musical accompaniment to this play. And this was our idea, and we kind of thought, well, geez, what if we tried to find a found space for this play? Because again, that would save us a little bit of money. And we thought, hey, what the hell? Why don't we try and use this space we've been using as rehearsal space to put up the play? So we approached the manager and the Philippones about it, and they were totally game. And so that was what kind of happened in very early 2018. It was like a January production or something. We put up this play. We put like a bunch of kind of risers in the back room where our bar now is, and basically where our bar now is was kind of the stage. It was a pretty small, simple set kind of thing. And put up some theater lights and some curtains and basically made that back room into a little black box theater. And then the front area that's now kind of where everyone sees the jazz and comedy shows kind of became like the lobby, basically. And, we used to have that little bar in the corners. There was kind of like a corner bar and a bit of a lobby waiting room, and then you could go into the mini theater, which could only seat about 35-40 people.
Right.
And then we put on this play, and it was kind of a runaway success. We really didn't expect it, but it was a bit of a runaway success, and it's partly because it was a good play, and I think we did a good job of it. And also because, there was something about us staging it in the Penthouse that just, if anybody's used to trying to promote projects, artistic projects, shows or whatever in Vancouver, you might know, it might be this way in every city, but it's definitely this way in Vancouver, where you gotta find some kind of hook, that the media can use. And in that case, it was like, wow, it was pretty obvious what the hook was, which is that we were bringing this entertainment back to this like sort of forgotten about, unused space above the Penthouse. And so like we got a lot of CBC attention and stuff like that, and we literally had bringing the CBC kind of CBC radio through the place, and being like, well, now we're going up the stairs that Sammy Davis Jr. used to go up or whatever. It was like the early days of the name dropping that everybody's used to me doing kind of thing every single week now. And so that production was a runaway hit, actually won an award as well. And so we basically were able to kind of parlay that into the idea of, well, this is kind of good, don't you think? Like, this was kind of unused. Why don't we sort of like bring some arts back to the space? What do you think about that? And the family that runs the club were absolutely game for it. So, and they were also game for us picking the name Tyrant Studios, which we thought was funny. I'm looking, again, the listeners can't see, but I'm literally looking at a skull on a nice display skull on Will's side table here, which I'm like, you didn't steal that from Tyrant.
That is Vez's skull. We call him Yorick.
Oh, okay.
He's got the Shakespearean name. I can never remember if your skull at Tyrant that sits on the piano has a name, though.
No, a lot of people just call it Scully, but I don't remember the name, but it is the last musician that left a drink on the piano. So
yeah, I'm sorry, I should have pretended that I put that there as a prop just for you.
Yeah, we've got a nice little toque. I'll be bringing out the Santa hat for ours pretty soon. So
yeah, we dress him up too.
Yeah.
You mentioned the name dropping that you do every time. This is like a speech that you do as part of your emceeing at Tyrant on most shows that if you go you will hear, and you always get very animated and you make the most of that spot, that's for sure, to talk about all the legendary jazz performers and people who have come through that venue owned by the Philippone family in Vancouver for decades and decades, and the spot for its entire history, which would go back like a century, right?
Yeah, basically.
Yeah.
Or
coming up on, So Somebody asked me if I could get you to read the speech on the show here, but no.
Well, I can't read the speech because it's different every night.
Because you make it up every time. Yeah, you have your things that you stick to, but you enjoy the process of improvising that every time, I know.
A little bit. Well, there's so much to draw on. I mean, the story of the Filipponi family and the Penthouse is a really interesting story in the context of, Vancouver, modern sort of colonial city to kind of Vancouver history, because in a lot of ways it kind of, spans the history of this pretty young city, again, in a sort of modern Western world sense. And, that family originally came from southern Italy in Calabria, and they ended up in the Dunsmuir mines on Vancouver Island, which is a whole interesting study to be done, too, because there were people that came from all over the world to work in these Dunsmuir coal mines on Vancouver Island, right? And so you had people like, a lot of the Filipponi sons ended up with Welsh names because a lot of the co-miners in the mines were Welsh. And, so there was Italians and Welsh and people coming from all these parts of the world looking for some way up for their family and the future of their family kind of deal. Eventually the family moved to Vancouver, and it was basically by that point the sons, who were pretty much teenagers at that point, if I've got that right, we are talking the 20s, so you're right, it's about a century ago, basically started a delivery business, Eagle Time Delivery, and famously it was Joe Filipponi, the kind of lead brother, who's pictured on our old bar back there, still a big photo of him in Tyrant Studios, who had the leg up on all the other local delivery businesses because he bought a motorcycle in the kind of early days of motorcycles. So everybody else had, bicycles for the local delivery, and Eagle Time had the motorcycle. So zoom, they could get it there, the fastest. And back in those days, at least in our town, delivery was the same as a taxi company. So they were doing everything from delivering newspapers, packages, anything you'd have in a pure later sense nowadays, but also basically being a taxi company. And that's kind of how they sort of built that up and bought, the building that's now the sort of floor level of the Penthouse Night Club to be the base of operations for Eagle Time Delivery. And then you kind of go, fast forward a little bit later till we're into the 30s and into the 40s. Joe decided to build himself an apartment on top of the Eagle Time Delivery. Now, the family home was just next door, right? Now, I often say that in my speech, and you can see it's one of the only, basically on that stretch of Seymour, it's the only still surviving little, peak-roofed home, but all of Seymour Street looked like that back in the day kind of thing, except for a few kind of garage-type businesses, and pretty much everywhere was like single story or kind of story and a half in height type of deal. But he built this penthouse apartment on top of the Eagle Time Delivery, which is now where we have Tyrant Studios. And it was basically like he essentially was running a nightclub out of his living room. And, like you would do things like, hey, you go there and bring your own booze basically and go hang out. And he would be saying, I'm just having private parties with my friends. But then he would, sell you like ice or 7-Up at an inflated price, you know what I mean? And if you forgot your booze, maybe there was a little bit in the back kind of thing he could sell you to. But obviously, the police weren't stupid and they knew what was going on. And so they would raid the place. And this became kind of a regular occurrence throughout the 40s. So at some point in, 1946, if I've got that right, there was a big raid on Joe's penthouse. And that was the headline that made the newspapers the next day, raid on Joe's penthouse. And that was the family's way of kind of turning it around on the media and the cops, was just to name their nightclub the Penthouse. So you could say that where we are upstairs at Tyrant, which again was like unused and forgotten about for decades, is basically, where the Penthouse actually got its name.
Yeah.
There's you can look more into this, but there's a sort of a really interesting history in Vancouver when it comes to booze, basically, because like the whole city was pretty much founded around a saloon. If you go down and into Gastown, you talk about good old Gassy Jack's saloon and stuff like that, right? This is basically like in these early logging days, it was just the whole town was founded around a watering hole,
Yeah.
But once you got out of the First World War, there was sort of like attempts to basically impose a kind of teetotaling aesthetic in this town, right? They had a bit of a failed experiment with kind of a proper prohibition around the First World War times, but then their solution, as I understand it, was to effectively like try, by way of laws, to divorce fun from alcohol consumption in a kind of systemic way. And so for a long time in Vancouver, you couldn't exactly, just as like a proprietor wanting to start a private business, get a liquor license. They weren't really available to be applied for. They were very, very sort of carefully doled out kind of thing. A couple of the hotels were allowed to have, I guess, what we would now call cocktail bars. And then otherwise you could only drink in these places called beer bars. And they were like basically like by design, no fun drinking joints. And a lot of them were kind of in and around, what would now be the downtown east side kind of thing. These kind of bars with no windows. They had, as I understand it, 2 entrances always, because there was the men only entrance and woman accompanied by a man entrance, so couldn't go in there as a woman on your own, with the exception of a few sort of ladies of the evening who would, be allowed to be waiting in there to drum up some business kind of thing. There was no fun allowed, though. You couldn't sing, you couldn't dance, there was no music in there was no darts, there was no pool, you couldn't even belly up to the bar. So basically all you could do legally at an actual drinking hole in Vancouver for decades was just like go get a beer in silence, go drink it in silence. And then if you wanted to go have fun at an actual other venue, you had to go to these supper clubs, right? Which would be like, there'd be burlesque and stuff going on there, but they were not drinking joints. There was not legally allowed to sell booze. So go somewhere else to dance and party where you couldn't drink kind of thing. And that was how the city was kind of trying to do this. So anyways, that's sort of rambling, but basically what happened as a result is that there was a real speakeasy culture in this town, even though it wasn't for the same reasons as when you had prohibition in the US kind of thing. And, so there were numerous of these places that were basically just, bars operating out of people's attics and basements. And the Penthouse became by far the most famous of them for 2 main reasons. And one is that they were open later than everywhere else in the early days, like open till like 5, 6 in the morning. So wherever you were, you knew you could go to the Penthouse afterwards, kind of no matter what time of the night or early hours it was. And then the other reason is maybe more connected to what we do, which is that, the Filiponis were very connected with the music scene and the touring music scene at the time. And so it also became the place where you could go to, rub shoulders with Frank Sinatra, or possibly even see Sammy Davis Jr. get on the stage and, sing you a tune kind of deal.
Yeah. Does it ever strike you that right now, if you look at the jazz community in Vancouver, or whatever you would call any of the groups of people that we spend our time with, even where it doesn't overlap, the people that in the creative community too, maybe you do have some other examples like this, but if I think of the jazz venues like Frankie's right now, or Second Floor Gastown right now, or other spaces like that, it's like where you are and what you have at Tyrant versus some of these other places, like you are an ambassador of like a historic place that is rich with tradition, that is relevant to this community, and you really own that role. The history, you love the history, and you talk about it.
Well, I do love the history, and that's like maybe that's a neat way of thinking about it. I suppose that is the case, and that, I would have to take that on. Like what it only makes, we tried to seize the opportunity of producing work there, because we just thought it'd be, no matter what, it's just always cool to have more art spaces in town. But yes, when you've got a space that has all of that history, you sort of feel like, wow, like that's a real shame if that wasn't still going, And from the perspective of the Penthouse, it's been like, one of the most successful things I think that they've done with their branding over the last 10, 15 years has been to draw more focus towards that history.
Yeah. It makes me fired up to like one day have music at the Patricia again, right? Like that's one of the only other examples of a place that has like a history that long, or even longer, where, you have the connection with Jelly Roll Morton having been in residence there in the past, and now we don't have jazz there, but we did for a while.
No kidding. Yeah, no, that's a perfect example. And a lot of the other places are gone too. There's a big new painting that we just hung in the back room that my aunt actually did, of another old venue in town that was around in the 70s and such, called Fort Boogie down on East Hastings there. And like, it's literally a parking lot now, so a lot of these places, a lot of the, big places, places that the big artists would perform at in town, are totally bulldozed now. A lot of them were, there's kind of a district that was also kind of around Burrard and Robson kind of thing, in that area, just coming up the hill from Burrard Station kind of thing. And obviously all that was flattened, to make way for the Bent Hall Center and the more modern stuff around that area kind of thing, So a lot of the old music clubs that we did have, even when, Vancouver was like the neon capital of the world and this kind of stuff, and that brief period, in the late 50s into the 60s kind of thing, are gone, are like actually physically gone. So yeah, a few places that we have, we ought to find a way to celebrate it. Yeah. I don't know. I mean, I think I think that I actually genuinely, like, I don't just say this out of diplomacy, I genuinely love all the jazz venues that we have in town. I think it's, Vancouver doesn't really have a kind of like French Quarter thing, right? Like, you can't like come to Vancouver and be like, oh man, I'm in the jazz district, and you're just like walking with your beer from one place to another kind of thing. Like, yes, we don't have that. Yeah. And so it is one of those cities where, artistically, you sort of got to be a bit in the know. You got to have someone to tell you like, oh, well, here's the places to check out, But all of the venues are like fantastic in their own ways, and they really are. A place like the Water Street Cafe is a fantastic listening room, and when you go to places like Havana, they've got a place like Frankie's. It's really that kind of dinner jazz club is also a big part of like live jazz experience, having that kind of venue as well. And so I feel like, we can sort of name drop when it comes to some of the history, because we happen to be, upstairs in the penthouse. But everywhere that is providing jazz in this town is also providing, the atmosphere of all of these places do have their own perks, Mm-hmm. And I guess sometimes maybe it depends just what you're in the mood for, or whether you feel like a certain act is well suited to that room,
Yeah. Now that you've been doing bookings in this jazz community at Tyrant for the past 5 years, do any times come to mind in particular where you booked somebody there at Tyrant to play a show and they just completely surprised you and blew you away, and like you had never heard this person play before or this group play before, and you were like, wow, I knew I wanted to do this because I said yes to this, but then somebody came down and they played and the show just blew you away in terms of what they brought to the table and how it was? Like, I'm curious about that sort of thing.
Something's come to mind. One that immediately comes to mind was, what were we? This was definitely post-pandemic, but it was like just kind of post-pandemic when we were reopening, I think, where there was a December show there. That was a show that Todd Stewart put on. Like he was the one I gave the date to, kind of thing. He was like, oh, I've got this, really interesting band in mind. I want to make sure I get this right. I think it was Dan Howard on the bass, but it was definitely Noah French Nolan on the piano, who I hadn't really heard, but was sort of a little bit aware of. Oh, those guys from back in town, kind of thing. And Faven Kadani, and that was also hadn't heard of Faven. I think Faven was just getting out of school, maybe at the time, kind of thing, right? Uh-huh. Oh no, there's a great trumpet player. I really want to bring him to the room. So that show happened, and that show it definitely is still amongst, maybe my top 5 or 6 shows that I've booked there. There was something about that quartet. They chose really good music, in my opinion, and they played really well. Like, it was one of those where, I think it was really the first major time anyway that I'd seen Noah play, and I was just like, had my face completely melted kind of thing. But I loved that show, and it was like a super busy room, and there was a really like great vibe in the room, and it was one of those nights where I've joked about this before, and I know it's like sort of it feels sort of like maybe absurd and nerdy or something like that, but there really are, like, in my opinion, the 4 A's is the way to judge whether a night is good. It's like, are you going to get a score of 4 A's out of A's or whatever kind of thing? And they basically amount to attendance. That's one factor. If there's good attendance, that's always great, but it doesn't necessarily make or break whether a show is good. There's atmosphere, because that's not exactly the same as attendance. For some reason, sometimes you can get a busy room where just, I don't know, the atmosphere is not totally gelling, and you get a slightly less busy room, but like everybody's just totally game for that show. So the two of those are often work together, right? They often sort of come as a package, but they're not exactly the same thing. Obviously, there's artistry is what I consider one of the A's as well, which is like, when just whatever, if the band is good. And the other, surprise, surprise, is alcohol sales, because that's how we survive. So, if you get all 4 of those, then like, boom, it's that you got all 4 bases. It's a home run, you're all the way around kind of thing. And a lot of shows will like hit 3 out of 4. You know what I mean? It's like what 3 out of 4 it is, I'm not sure, right? You can get shows that like great atmosphere, great attendance, great alcohol sales. And it's like, wow, what could be wrong with this show? Well, frankly, I actually didn't really like the band that much, that kind of thing. So it's like the artistry was the one thing that like didn't actually rise to the top. And so, there's often one of those missing, if not 2 of those missing kind of thing. And if you can hit all 4 of those, then you really get a night where people are like, dang, like, oh, I want to be here again sometime, So there's definitely been, plenty of those. And it's more like, it's been more rare that I've been distinctly disappointed in a show. And I'm not going to go to the point of naming any names there, but like it, certainly has happened when you book someone and you're kind of like, oh man, like there's little things where you're just kind of like, really? Like you didn't, okay, I get that it's jazz, especially if you're playing standards, and I get that if you're really good enough, you might not need to rehearse. But sometimes people who don't think they need to rehearse with a group do need to rehearse with a group. Then they show up and play a show, and you're like, yeah, okay, guys, what would have made that show good? If you rehearsed, So you get these little things that happen every once in a while where you're like, come on, like I know we're not Madison Square Garden, but you could at least behave like this was an opportunity and you want to make good on that opportunity, But that's more rare, and we'll see. I'll think there might be more shows that pop into my mind, but that was the first one that popped into my mind because it always sort of defines to me a night that I didn't really know what to expect. I just knew that I liked Todd's drumming and I wanted to give him a shot. And he was like, no, I got a clear vision of what I want for this show. And thus it still kind of lives in my head as one of those ones that just kind of like manifested and rose out of the water and hit all those 4 A's, as it were. And
so if that was a quad A show, maybe more about expectations than actual results, because actual results may vary. That's, I'm sure, one of the things that you learn if you book a venue for that number of years and beyond. But what's your expectation? You don't have to think about it too much, but like if you were to say a X% of shows are gonna be those quad A rare awesome shows, like how low is that number? Is it 5%? Is it 10%? Like what's your baseline expectation of how rare that is?
I don't know, it might be something like that. It might be something like 10%.
So because you present now like 2 or 3 times a week at a minimum, that means it's like less than once a month kind of thing.
Interesting. Well, maybe the percentage is wrong. I think, I don't know. It's almost like you start to need a new category. You start to get like the quad A plus. You know what I mean? It's like, you get somewhere it's like really hitting it out of the park kind of thing. It's not only a home run, but a home run that the newspapers talk about the next day. So maybe there's a whole other category that gets down into just like 5% of those shows. And I don't know. I think if we're all, honest as bookers and stuff, it probably is for those really special shows, something like that. Because there's that last little, that's that one A, that's the atmosphere thing. Like that's just this little thing, and you just don't know it until It's the magic of live entertainment, is that you just can't get it without it being ephemeral in the moment. And, you can't know whether it's been gotten until you're actually there experiencing it.
Yeah.
But I do think it's more than that. Like nowadays we're, things are a little bit different in terms of the scope of programming. So I've been able to bring in things that are departing a little bit more from jazz, even though I've always got to make sure they fit the vibe and the just sound levels and stuff in the room. But especially on Saturdays, which is now a regular music night, I'm able to do things like a lot of, Latin dance nights and stuff. And a lot of those will rise to that top. There's some just fantastic, Latin bands in town. And that was all started by Amphibious. Those folks are fantastic. But that was kind of like a early idea that actually Chundan, who, I still hired to play in my band. Like, I've got this Brazilian band I play in. And that was one of those where it was like, sort of redefines the scope of things. You're like, well, we're definitely doing this again, and it's hard to think of one of those nights that's been, less than a quad A achievement. Those guys are always fantastic nights. So maybe, that's like, maybe it's all kind of folded in a way that, like, as I'm sort of trying new things and seeing what different type of programming that I can bring into the room just opens up more opportunity for people to hit home runs,
Yeah. The reason why I focus on it is definitely not to say that the other shows aren't good, because they are. Even if those ones are rare, the other shows can all still be very good, and there can still be a very high level of programming. The reason why I focused on it for sure is because if you're listening as an artist, I wouldn't want you to do what I would be inclined to do, which would be to like beat yourself up if you didn't do that on any given show of yours, because it's almost like part of getting a show out and completing a show to that standard is like beyond your control to some extent. Like you can prepare for it, but it's like you can't put the blame on yourself if you feel like your last show wasn't that good, because it is rare, right? It's like it can still be really good, and those ones can still be super rare, because you can remember from your own playing history like which year shows felt amazing on all levels and stuff. So that's why I'm thinking about it.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's a really good point to bring up. And I think that, if anybody's like, I think about it sometimes when I see people, make, I think, errors of judgment or whatever, and some in things they want to bring into the space or how they brought them in. And I just try and think of myself as a younger musician. I made, I think, a lot of mistakes just being excited and this kind of thing, right? And I look back on it. And so, yes, like if I'm, old enough now to be dispensing wisdom, which, I feel like I'm getting old, but some people might not say I'm old enough to be wise. But is that, we want to be cautious about a couple of things. Like these are the things that I would tell young folks, like, don't overbook your bands. That's the biggest lesson of local entertainment. And we can all feel like, damn, like, it really sucks because I want to be playing every single weekend, and I just want to be playing, and I want people to see this band, and I want to, this kind of thing. But it's like, they're not, you don't have the fan base, you're not Taylor Swift, you're not Five Alarm Funk, you're not going to be, packing out these venues. So, if you're playing with a group, like more, as a jazz musician or as like a singer-songwriter type, and you're trying to play more than once a month, then like, you've really got your work cut out for you to be bringing people out to those shows. And like, don't be stupid. Like in a lot of ways, venues are a one strike, you're out. I don't know. I don't even watch baseball, and yet, and we've got all these baseball metaphors going,
baseball analogies,
hitting around the bases and everything. But that's pretty much like, it's a one strike, you're out often with these venues, and if you go and you're like, oh, thanks for booking us, and like 5 people show up or something like that, then it's like, why would they give you even a second chance? So you don't even really get a 3 strikes, you're out. You might have to wait like a whole year, and then you kind of come back with your tail between your legs to this person and like, hey, do you think you'd give me another chance? So just don't be stupid about that, is what I would say. Don't be flagrant about that. Take that seriously. If you get You know, if if you get the Monday night slot at Gilton Company, like call in your favors, you know, bring out all your friends to that show, and then you'll get a Thursday, you know, that kind of thing. And that has been the case. You know, there are some people who have asked me for second dates at the venue, and I haven't given it to them. And it might be, you know, it'll be a mixture of those things. Like if you come in and deliver what to me is kind of a sloppy performance, and then you also didn't bring people out, then just like, what are you thinking? Like it's, you know.
That's like, we're talking about like a 1 out of 4 on your
yeah
scale.
yeah then you're talking basically probably about a 1 out of 4 kind of thing. That's right. So yes, there's a lot that is beyond your control, because sometimes who knows, like it's like we're at a space now as a venue where we're starting to develop a bit of word of mouth thing, and especially like the Friday Jazz brand is a bit of a meme that people can keep in the back of their mind and know that, you know, whatever they get out of something else they're doing downtown, it's like, oh, isn't there Friday Jazz? I think there's stuff going on over at Tyrant there. And so that grows, but you just don't know what that's going to mean. And so sometimes, you know, you've got everything planned and you're coming in for your show and you've done everything right. You know, you've invited all the people, you rehearsed the band, blah, 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 blah. But also it happens to be a night that, like, you know, a group of 10 at a work party or something that don't even know you decided to come take in Friday Jazz or whatever. And for some reason they won't shut up or something like that. Like these things happen, you know what I mean? And so it isn't always your fault, but there are things that you can do. And, you know, like, again, to sound sort of grumpy old man about it, what I would say to like anyone starting out is like, don't be sort of like cocky to the point that you're, that even though you don't think you are, you're actually disrespecting the person who's given you the opportunity. And that would mean things like, as much as possible, come in sounding rehearsed. I don't care if you rehearsed. Like, I'm not going to police that, but you better sound rehearsed. If you don't sound rehearsed, like, you know, all of us who like, but we just sit there like rolling our eyes at the back of the room kind of thing. Take the time to do it. You know, if you can't get like a good band together, approach me and ask for a different date. You know, like time passes quickly, you know, it's like, oh, we're not going to do January, we'll do March instead, but it'll be way better for all of us. That's way better for you, because, you know, it's going to be 2027 before you know it, let alone March kind of thing. So try to make good on all of those things. And it's definitely, you know, it's definitely better for everyone. And that's where it all kind of works too, because when you're kind of being like, you know, obviously it's a whole thing too about whether you're, you know, feel you're paid well for a gig. And it's one thing I was like, note about jazz musicians going through school is like, yeah, you're learning this really, really great skill and you ought to be paid for it. But if you've ever been part of an indie band, like that's a whole other thing. It's like entirely passion project. So, you know, we're all like rehearsing every single Monday so we can go out and make, you know, $40 as a band playing on a 5-band bill, you know what I mean? But it's because you're really trying to sort of push your own thing. So if you want to also be like living up to the culture where it's like, no, like I'm a primo musician, you know, I went to school for this and all this kind of thing. You do have to deliver on the day, you know. That's the one place where you ought to be meeting people more than halfway.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's a process that people all have come on different timelines too. Sometimes it's hard to predict where somebody is at. Sometimes their playing evolution of them as a player can be completely different from their social skills or their business skills or whatever you would call it. And you kind of have to take all that as it comes, because lots of people are reaching out to you all the time and trying to book things with you. You know some of them, maybe you don't know some of them. At this point, you probably know most. So you're trying to make everybody happy, but you're also trying to keep all this in mind and make sure that the standard of the music keeps growing, which it feels like it does from what you're saying, because now you're presenting more often at Tyrant and the quality of the music is really good. So it's like, this is just something that you have to manage as you go, right?
Totally.
Yeah.
And the venue started out and with people not knowing what it was. And so it's like, you know, there's a lot of I think that we were able to give a lot of opportunity to a lot of young jazz musicians and comedians, in the early days, because nobody knew the place existed. And so, but it was a place that you could come and play. And, some of those early Friday jazz things, right? There's like 6 people in the audience kind of thing. And that'd be like a good night type of deal, So, the early days, I think a lot about that, because I'd like to be able to keep as much as possible Tyrant as a place that's continuing to offer opportunities to young musicians coming just out of school kind of thing. But also, the venue grows, and it's like you can be only as good as your last meal, right? There's that kind of thing. Like when you go out to a restaurant that you've always liked, and for some reason that one day they didn't cook the meal properly, like it be 6 months before you go back again, or it might be a year before you go back again, because that negative experience can wash away a number of positive experiences. So it's not, we don't quite have the luxury anymore to just put anything up without at least being concerned, invested in it being a good experience for our audience, and so I try to find that balance. It's why I tell people when they're reaching out to me for a date to reach out to me, make sure they reach out to me, because I will keep a list of people basically in order that they reached out to me. And so you're going to be in that list. But then when I'm ultimately trying to book the months, there's other things that come into the programming equation. It's got to be, okay, is this going to be a really good night? Does it seem to fit with, the kind of, I don't know, a sort of like some sense of variance in the programming that month, something like that. But I do still try to pay attention to people, and I definitely, like all those other things being equal, I'll give somebody who's, young and established the same level of opportunity. That's one thing at our venue, it's like, it's going to be more about the actual like demos you can send me, or the intriguing nature of the project. If I think that it's got a good angle to cut through the noise of the other programming going on in the scene, that's way more important to me than how many years you've been in the scene,
Yeah. I want to ask you what a dream level goal that you have for Tyrant is, like, because of how much you've grown it already. Like if it kept growing to the nth degree of how you could imagine it to, where could it go in the next couple of years? And like what would it look like if you just put on your full optimism glasses and you think about the potential of it?
Wow. I mean, yeah, what would it look like? I guess just more stuff, more people, like it's when there's really good nights there, I feel like that's what I want to see the place as, right? It's only so big. So like, yeah, again, like any sort of high-end restaurant or whatever, like you want to basically get a place where you're regularly having to tell people like, sorry, we don't have any room for you tonight kind of thing. And then there's like really just a demand for...
Then you get the FOMO, right? Then
yeah, then you get the FOMO. Yeah. So it wouldn't, like, I don't know, in terms of atmosphere or vibe, it wouldn't be so different, but there'd be little things like, could we expand to yet another night a week? Is there room for more early or late programming? Like I've done a bunch of little pilot projects and they work out or they don't, because, obviously there's a lot of unique things about our circumstance being inside the Penthouse building and going through those same sort of front doors. So we have a lot of, we have to schedule things a lot with their front door staff and this kind of thing. So there's these little, like, there's these teeny little, inflection points or whatever, cruxes kind of thing, devils in the details, about that venue. But it would be like the more that the venue can prove itself, the more that those things can sort of, take care of themselves or make their own argument for themselves. So there's all sorts of little things like, it'd be just, better and better equipment, stuff like that, money to do better restoration work more quickly on the piano, for instance, or bring in just, better speaker and monitor stuff. Those are all like little details, but I would just love to see more of that stuff, coming into place. Like, I'm still at a place now where, if the vocalist that night needs an extra wedge monitor, I've got to, steal the speaker from the back room and reemploy it in the front, So these are all little things, or it's like some of the sconce lights on the side, like the electrical wiring doesn't work anymore. So those are actually just little like battery operated things. And like, at least once a month, I'm up there standing on a chair replacing batteries so that we can give the illusion of mood lighting to our customers, So it's little things like that are maybe not all that interesting and that don't actually change too much. When there's a good night at Tyrant, it is kind of how I see it in the future. I just see more of that and fewer of the little like bugaboos that I have to deal with on the back end.
Yeah. So in terms of the Seven Tyrants and the structure and the operations of Tyrant, do you still have your co-founder? Do you have a team with more people involved right now? Has a lot of it focused on yourself? Who's on your team right now in this era of running Tyrant?
Yeah, the main team right now is still kind of like, basically the core 3 producers from the early days. My co-artistic producer, David, is dealt a lot more with the comedy in the early days and, basically has a young family now through the pandemic. So is not on the ground there as much for those 2 reasons. But he, works a lot in sort of computers and printing and stuff like that. And so he helps a lot on the back end. So that's, he's still involved, but it's a different dynamic than pre-pandemic where it was Friday jazz, Saturday comedy. And so, there's the producing the venue stuff in the background, but then even on the ground presence, on the nights, we would sort of be sharing that 50% and, and the actual producing of the event that night, we'd be sort of doing, I would do Friday, he would do Saturday kind of thing. That dynamic is a little bit different, but he's still there. And then Kurt as well. Kurt sort of took some time away helping as a producer on the space. But has come back recently to help out. And we're at a place right now where, just about every night that we're open, we need more than just me as the one staff member kind of thing. So that's really helpful as well. So it's basically the 3 of us that are kind of keeping that going. But there's a big partnership as well with some of the managers and staff in the Penthouse. Yeah, they're super helpful and supportive of what we do. So we got to be in contact with them about, restocking the bar and stuff like that all the time. So if we didn't have good relationships with those folks, it would just, we would just be like an irritant, to them. I mean, so like, I'm doing my job for the downstairs club. Why do I also have to help you kind of thing?
Yeah.
So that's really helpful. Pre-pandemic, we had Cobra was our bartender, right? And we couldn't have brought the space to life without Cobra.
I do recall.
Absolutely, for sure. She's off, doing plenty of other stuff these days kind of thing since the pandemic. But that really helped to be able to also get that side of things. And she left a legacy, with some of the other bartenders and bar staff as well kind of thing. So I don't know. It's basically like those are the kind of 4 names that are gonna that are relevant or whatever that are keep this whole thing going.
Yeah. And then I'm curious also for you, like in your day-to-day and your week-to-week and how you handle it, like on a scale of 1 to Tim Reinert, where, you have like full-time day job and you're also running the Infidels to great success. It's like, how are you handling it day-to-day? What does your time look like that you have to put into it? Just like, how does that side of it feel when it's a day in your life or a week in your life? Like how does that work for you these days now that you're presenting like 3 nights a week and it isn't just like Friday jazz, I'm taking care of this one, Saturday comedy, you're taking care of this one? Like how are you managing it right now?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's like bigger slice of my pie of work these days for sure. It's a big chunk of the work that I do these days is working for Tyrant. I've got to spend work on it every day. It obviously never ends. Every time you answer an email, 2 more emails come in. So it's it really is like a lot of that kind of correspondence stuff, and then all the silly little things of updating the website and stuff or whatever, making a Facebook event. Like these things like take time, even if you get it largely automated. And so it's really tough to go through a day without in some way putting work, let alone several hours of work into Tyrant. And then sometimes you got to go actually work the night as well. So, I'm a multidisciplinary performing artist by trade. Like I'm an actor by training, and also musician by training, and through whatever, like I guess like just work and insanity, I don't know, combined together over the years. I make it work. I make my living in this grab bag of work to do with the performing arts. So but I still have to do side hustle work too, especially during the pandemic when all my theater work got shut down. I took on this tour guide, like historical tour guide job in Gastown, and I still do those pretty regularly because it's actually a pretty fun gig, and especially during cruise ship season it can pay pretty well. But so you're never gonna get away with if you're an actor, and you got to have something equivalent to a serving job. Although I've never actually worked in a restaurant, but I've done all sorts of that stuff over the years, working at museums and this kind of thing. But for a couple of years pre-pandemic, I had actually gotten into a groove where I was basically surviving entirely off artistic work, but it had to be I had to make sure I got some good acting contracts that year, which might take me out of town for several months, and a lot of sound design work I would have to buttress that with. But nowadays, Tyrant is a veritable actual job amongst it all, and it has to be because especially with the way some of the roles have shifted over the last little while, I'm not trying to brag. I was trying to figure out how to say this. I'm not bragging, but I am doing most of the work when it comes to our producing team or whatever. So I've got to make sure that it's also a job, and I can also survive doing it, and it's not just free time.
Yeah, you went to UBC for acting, right?
I did.
Yeah. Now, because that was a little while ago, I went to CAP a little while ago too. So, fair enough. We're in the same boat. I imagine it's kind of funny to think about, for example, if I think about going to CAP, very little about going there other than meeting some key people prepared me or matched in any way what I'm doing right now with rhythm changes or with even my playing or anything like that. And I imagine it's probably pretty similar for you. Like the acting program that you did, it probably prepared you in one or two specific ways for the vast variety of stuff that you've ended up doing, from doing museum things and tours in Gastown to presenting your venue. But the world of stuff that you've gone out and seen, you could never have imagined when you were studying there, I bet, if it's anything like how I look back on my experience at CAP for music.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Basically what you're saying is you never thought that you'd be running the comprehensive gig list in town and a podcast or anything like that. That wasn't what you envisioned all those years ago. In that case, it's similar.
I didn't envision the component work that made it up is maybe even more what I'm thinking, and maybe that would apply to you as well. The things that you have to do day to day for any of those things, whether you're out doing contracts or whether you're doing tours in Gastown or whether you're doing the administration of Tyrant, and the component things of what I do, producing audio or going to shows and writing about them and listening to all this new music and publishing about them and trying to curate all of that, just you would curate a venue almost. It's those things are all kind of emergent components of what you just described as it has to end up as a job or it has to end up as work. And it's these are all things that have hit me as they come, and I wouldn't have predicted what they were at all, or I wasn't prepared for them at all. That's kind of what I'm thinking.
Yeah. Yeah, well, no kidding. Like, there's the larger scale of it where it was like, yeah, I never thought I'd be, running a jazz venue in town one day kind of thing. So there's that sort of larger version of it. But then also, yeah, like, I never thought I'd be spending like regular significant parts of my time going out and buying replacement battery operated candles or something. You know what I mean? It's like, but those are important component things, right?
Yeah.
That's also where I think that that like my theater training, I think, helps with some of this, because like, I think that a lot of what you do in a venue, in any kind of, artistic experience that people are going to appreciate, is this kind of like sort of sleight of hand theater magic. It is important, how the curtains hang behind the thing, I've always got this thing of like, there's like these teeny little like OCD things I almost want to say, that I can't let go of or whatever, are things like that, like drummers will inevitably come into our space and like lean their drum bag against the back curtains and stuff like that. And it's like, well, yeah, totally. I don't care, except that when it comes to performance time, I am going to be that guy that walks up and is like, hey, can we just move that cymbal bag because it's making the curtains not hang properly,
Somebody's got to do it.
And then it always bugs me if I miss it, you know what I mean? And then like through the whole show, there's this like little gap in the back curtain or something, you know what I mean? It's just kind of like, no, guys, like you can see the strings. Like, no, come on. So there's little things like that, that are important. And that's something that you sort of, that is the theater of the experience. And I think that's something that you, learn in theater. And it's like you get these little things that, people might not think about, but they maybe contribute a bit. Our little weird, like a stanchion, sort of red thing that sort of pseudo separates when you first walk in from where the seating is. It's like I remember my co-producer Dave. At one point I was like, do we really need this for flow and stuff? And my co-producer was basically like, oh, sometimes you just need a little showbiz, and it's true. Sometimes you just need a little showbiz, but you gotta pay attention to, like everyone knows our skull, which, on
you're thinking about it.
Mentioned exactly. It's your skull won't stop staring at me. So, but that was one of those things that our first Halloween in the space, we just had very few. We actually used to produce a pretty successful haunted house out of the classical Chinese garden in Chinatown for a bunch of years, and we had all these like skeletons and stuff from that in our company storage. And so our first Halloween in the space, we brought some of that stuff out and just put it around the venue. And, but we were trying to be sort of like slightly minimalist, and tasteful, as opposed to just like miles and miles of cotton batten webbing or whatever. And so we just like the one sort of most realistic skull that we had, we just kind of like stuck it on the piano, and we're just kind of like, okay, there you go. And it never left. And but it's one of those things where it's like there's a spotlight on the skull, and yeah, you need to have a spotlight on the skull. And sometimes, like, just even in a scrappy place like we're in, where we've still got like that old, cardboard photo of Big Fanny Annie on the wall that like half the time someone leans back and they like knock it over or something like that. But like when you first enter the room, there ought to be a vibe, and some of that is inherently there because of the room that we've ended up in, and other of that are like, within the context of the recycled, reused, handed down, everything that has built up a lot of what's in the space, from the tables and chairs to the curtains and this kind of thing. There's consideration there, and part of that is about just creating the right vibe and atmosphere, and realizing that the details matter. And so I guess what I'm kind of beating around the bush there is that, like, I'm not saying that I always achieve all the details. That's not what I'm saying. You know what I mean? Like, sometimes you've got whatever. Sometimes you just don't, have the money for it or whatever, don't have the resources for it kind of thing. Do things exactly the way that you'd like. But so far as you can, you got to make sure that, the little details of presentation are there and not forgotten about, because it's the kind of things that people notice. And that's that's a really big, lesson that I took from producing small theater, is that you can, there's so many layers of it. It's like a Russian doll of this phenomenon, because you can be so on the inside of something that you can't see the forest for the trees. And that is like the curse of the artist in so many ways, I think, right? Like you can be, sometimes in the midst of recording an album or something, and you're just kind of like so obsessed about just like that moment, I really don't like that drum fill or something like that. But take a break, right? Go leave that project for a month, come back and be like, why was I so freaking obsessed with that drum fill kind of thing, And there's many, many instances of that, I think, as the artist, whether you're actually creating your work or whether you're creating the presentation of your work. And these teeny little things, right, can be your Achilles heel. And so you can put all this money and artistic effort, ingenuity into the actual performance, say, of a play. I'm saying this from absolute personal experience. You know what I mean? And you're just like, you get it all together. Like you basically kill yourself to get this thing ready for opening night. You know what I mean? And it's like, you're so happy with it, and you kind of come out and you greet your family in the lobby kind of thing. And what's the first thing they say? But like, but by the way, like why wasn't there any lobby music? And you're kind of like, lobby music? Like, what are you talking about, guys? Like, do you have anything to say about the play you just saw that, like, basically, like, took 2 years off my life to bring to you? But no, what was the first thing the audience experienced, was the fact that they walked into a theater lobby and there was no, like, atmosphere music or something on there. And so you got to be left going, like, wow, that was actually an incredibly small, incredibly important part of that audience experience,
Wow.
And, yeah, I think that the same can go for venues, but it also, like, it can have its opposite, it can have its corollary with live venues too, because sometimes, like, the scrappiness of a venue is part of its charm and its set design and its theater, but it's just about, I think, trying to find a way to step outside of your own internal artistic sense and think about the it's almost like, if anyone's familiar with any theater discipline, it's almost like viewpoints work, where you got to kind of try to have that sort of that audience eye, as they talk about. Like, even if you're like really within the scene and within the moment, you ought to also be thinking about, how is the audience experiencing this? And that's I still find that a tough thing to wrestle with, and to have both of those brains on if I'm actually producing an event, but that's a skill that I've been able to hone more and more as I spend so much more time just basically like curating what's ultimately other people's performances, because I can think about those outside things. Like, okay, guys, like, all this is really great, but your band would actually look better on the stage if the singer stepped over 2 feet this way, and that can seem like an absurd thing, but it's like, what it means is that when someone's taking a picture, when Vincent or Sapalo or whatever comes into the place and takes a picture, it's going to be a better picture. You're going to get the whole band in that picture. One of your band members isn't going to look 4 feet higher than the other band member, or, this kind of thing. So, and like, yeah, if you don't think about that stuff, all you're left with, there's a film director back in theater school that said that. He's like, the job of the director is to make sure you get the shot on the day. That's the job of the director. It's like, it's not about post-production vision. It's not about pre-production vision. Those things are all in there, I suppose, but it's about getting the shot on the day. Because if you dismantle the entire thing and then you go back and there's a boom mic that's made it into the shot, it's like, you can't fix that. I mean, I guess nowadays you could. Yeah, nowadays yes.
But that doesn't invalidate the point.
Yeah, it doesn't invalidate the point. At least I hope it doesn't invalidate the point.
Yeah. So it's the humility to adopt the audience view as much as possible to achieve success.
Totally.
Yeah.
And actually, you ought to think about that in terms of the way you put your sets together and stuff too. It's like, I like to impart these observations of mine, because they're like, they genuinely are as much for me, to try to remember when I'm performing. But people often ask, like, how long should the sets be, kind of thing. And I used to be like, they're just like 2 45-minute sets. But nowadays I'm a little bit more like, if you're going to have a shorter set, make it the first set. Like we talked about this last night when it was like, let's try to end the first set around 10:30 kind of thing. And I know my speech went a little bit long last night or whatever kind of thing. But the idea is that, like, you want to give people a really good first set that makes them be like, oh man, that was really awesome. But that doesn't totally fill them up. It's like either today I'm apparently either using baseball or restaurant metaphors. So back to another restaurant one, where it's like you get that like really, really good meal, but it's not good enough to fill your stomach. It's not big enough to fill your stomach. That's what you want out of a first set. People are sort of like, oh man, that little tagliatelle thing was amazing. You know what I mean? But I definitely also need the second course kind of deal. But also because, like, if you give them like a really awesome over 1 hour first set or kind of thing, then people are going to, especially since, we start our music at 9:30 or whatever, people are going to look at their watches and be sort of like, it's almost 11. Like, actually, why don't we go home? Like, it was a really great show. We were totally satisfied by it, but we had enough. Our stomachs are full. Let's go home. So you got to consider these little things. I also think that if you have guests in your set, you got to be careful about that. Kurt and I were talking about this the other day too, about how, like, that's a really precarious thing. Like, don't save your guest artists entirely for the second set unless you announce to the audience in the first set, because people might leave and then they're going to miss the guest artists, But also, like, give them a reason to stick around. So give them something in the second set that they're not going to get in the first set. So it's like a really good strategy, I think, if you've got, like, guest horn players or something like that coming up or whatever, or a guest vocalist, is like bring them up for like a tease moment in the first set, and then be like, you'll be seeing more of this person in the second set. And it just, gives the audience more reason to stick around kind of thing.
Yeah. Can we exit off of the Tyrant Highway for the time being and talk about your music? I would love to do that.
Of course.
Yeah. So in terms of what is out there in the world, when I think about, okay, what am I going to mention first because I want to hear more about it, the most recent project that's on my radar that you've got in terms of recordings is Lonely Birthday. Is that right?
That's right.
Yeah, released in 2021 under your name.
Yeah.
And you've also played several times this year at Tyrant with your own band.
Yeah.
And that is similar in some sense to what is on this album, Lonely Birthday. This album's on Bandcamp. It's also on streaming, so people can hear that wherever. Some of this music I've played before with you.
Yeah.
So I'm familiar with some of those tracks. There's a track that's instrumental. It's called Beggar's Theme that I've played with you before. There is a short track on the album. It's the last track, Song for Risa, that I've also played with you.
Yes.
And then there's a longer track called Mild September that I can't remember because I have played in your band once or twice. I can't remember if I played Mild September with you in that situation or if it was somehow worked into Bill's project because it was more epic like that. But I remember playing all of those.
Yeah, that's right. No. Those were played all with my band when I sort of pioneered that. Yeah, that project, which is just the Daniel Deorksen band these days. I'm thinking about renaming it in some way. And one of the names I've got right now that is a candidate is Dan Deorksen's Bicameral Collapse. So anyway, I'm just going to put that out there. So I'm not going to explain that, but if you know what that means, you know what that means. But that project was basically brought about to bring some of that material to life. Now, the stuff on Lonely Birthday, I've done a lot of sound design over the years, a lot of sound design work for theater. And a lot of times what that has involved for me is writing music. If you're going to hire me as a sound designer, it might be to, source a telephone ring, but it's probably going to be for something more than that because you want a little bit of original music composed or something, right? Mm-hmm. Maybe it's played live, maybe it's recorded. So I've got, a lot of things from over the years, both from shows that I've been hired to sound design and for shows that I've produced myself or that we produced ourselves with Seven Tyrants, where I was mainly a composer and musical director kind of thing, where I ended up with lots of home recordings basically of a lot of these things. And they've got sometimes like I just do this stuff and it's just for me to listen to. There's some kind of old Bob Dylan quote. I think it's a Bob Dylan quote. It's basically like I started writing because no one was playing what I wanted to hear. Sometimes I sort of feel like that, and I've been less concerned over the years that people really hear these songs, but I just kind of like they tickle my fancy, and so I would basically go sort of to town with my home recordings, but in a very sort of like ramshackle way kind of deal. So I put a lot of effort into the compositional aspect of these demos, basically, but not a whole lot of consideration into like the important minutiae of the actual engineering and recording. So I just ended up with like a bunch of these things, and a lot of them were done when I, lived in my place on East Broadway, where I was like I lived actually basically right on Broadway. And I think on that particular album, I even credit the traffic on East Broadway for some of some of the ambient noise, because it's like you stop and listen, you're like, what's going on there? It's like, no, that's just cars in the background, is what that is. So that's what that album is. I just took a handful of these recordings where I really liked the songs, but also just to me, really, more than anything else, I actually just liked the original recording, the kind of like scrappy, demo-ish sort of version of this recording that kind of got it in its fresh state kind of thing. And I just always wanted to hear that recording, not just that tune. And so one of my kind of small projects during the pandemic times was just to sort of slightly remix these and make them good enough that I could release them as a bit of a lo-fi home recording type of thing. So that's what that project is. I love all those tunes, and I'm proud of the composing on all those tunes. And then they've also all got their like super silly little things, where like, so there's at least one track where like some of the stuff is like recorded with a mic on my cell phone kind of stuff,
Yeah.
But there are a bunch of fun tunes. And then what I kind of did coming out of the pandemic was try to put together a band to play some of those tunes. And, they're all like personal tunes where I've played basically all the instruments on them kind of thing, but it's all just through layering at home. So I got to put together a band to play that stuff. And then it starts to, take on a world of its own. And I thought, okay, well, actually I ought to get a proper horn section for this. And oh yeah, dang, that's another tune I wrote that needs a violin. I guess I need a violinist, and this kind of thing. And that's what's kind of grown into the Daniel Deorksen band. So yeah, there's some, in that material, a lot of it is, some of it's just like my own singer-songwriter material. You get, songs like Mild September and Song for Risa, which, were both written about the same person. And you get tunes like The Beggar's Theme and the Execution March, which were written for the Beggar's Opera. One of our big productions about 10 years ago was a kind of reinventing of the Beggar's Opera, where I wrote a bunch of original music for that. So those themes came out of that. Surprise, surprise, King Richard is, from a production of Richard III, where I just decided to make one of the monologues into what one review described as a Disney villain-esque song, which was meant as an insult, but I took it as a compliment.
You embraced it?
Yeah. And so, yeah, that's kind of where that band is at. And I've started now in the last couple of performances with that band to also be bringing up some new material that I'm in the midst of recording, that's sort of tailored a little bit to that type of ensemble.
Yeah. So you've got, I know that you have new recordings in the works. You mentioned that to me at some point, that you're in the progress of putting out another record. And like, what would feel to me as like the best realization of the band that I've stepped out and played in with you that I've heard so far. Like, you're working on that right now.
I'm working on that right now. Yeah, that's a mixture. I'm doing some of the recording at home, but most of it I've been doing out of Monarch Studios, working with Dave Sekula.
Yeah.
And Dave is an absolute joy to work with, by the way, if you don't already know that, but your listeners probably will know that.
Yeah.
Really, really good engineer, but also just a really sort of like chill but intuitive and incisive kind of approach. So it's very like chill about wanting to work with what I want the sound to be like, but he'll also, give a sort of like really intelligent, considered observation when you know that, it's going to make the recording better. Be like, well, I actually think this might be the way to go on that kind of thing. And you'll be like, thank you. It's another forest for the trees thing. You just get somebody to like.
Is that his version of putting the lobby music on?
Yeah, that's exactly what it is. That's his version of putting the lobby music on, Yeah. So it's a great sort of a sounding board for the kind of confused moments of articulating one's vision.
Yeah.
I'm playing most of all the basic instruments myself again. So I started by going in guitar, bass, drums. Started with the drum recordings. Did the piano recordings there too. A lot of the electric guitar stuff I've done at home. So most of the tracking is done on that material. It will be a 7 or 8 6 to 8 song album, just depending on what I decide to actually put through the final thing. And most of that album has not been heard before. There's a neat tune that I wrote recently. At least I think it's fun. But it was one of these tunes I wrote like in Muse score. You know what I mean? I was just kind of playing around with notes and just writing and whatever. And then it was like, okay, I guess we'll try and put this on a band. And it had the working title of Paper Tyrant, which because it was a bit of tyranny on paper, but yeah, hey, also it's Tyrant. And then that we've played with this band a bunch, and that's a fun tune, and that's been sort of like a glimpse onto what the maybe a future musically for that project or some of my material could be. And that's an instrumental piece. But the rest of the stuff on the album, no one's going to have heard because I've never played it. Maybe like 1 or 2 of them I might have played at an open mic type of thing. Yeah. But it's almost all stuff, not entirely. It's almost all stuff that I wrote during the pandemic. A lot of it is introspective. I don't know how you felt during the pandemic, but for me, the pandemic was a real sort of like self-examination, course correction, like, what have I done with my life? Okay, I did some stuff, but oh God, but okay, but oh God, but oh okay, there was a lot of like lying awake at night kind of thing, being like, what have I done? And what do I want to do if this ever ends? So there were some tunes that came out of that all have this kind of vibe of just, taking myself to task is almost how I want to say it. And it's got a jazzy bluesy thing, but also a kind of singer-songwriter thing. And then there's a couple tunes that are older tunes, again, from the theater tradition. There's a great duet that I've wanted to record for years called A Time for Love, which was written for a production called Ebenezer, which was our kind of revamp of the Christmas Carol a bunch of Christmases ago that we did. And I wrote a bunch of music for that. And it's kind of a duet between Ebenezer Scrooge and Belle, his lost love. And I always just thought like, that's a tune. That's a tune I want to record and put on an album. So I've got that one on this recording as well. And I don't know, I had set kind of a target date for having it out before the end of this year, but I'm not sure I'm going to hit that.
Probably not.
Actually, I'm pretty sure I'm not going to hit that.
I'm pretty sure you're not.
The smile that went across your face was just like, that's not going to happen.
Yeah. But we will look forward to when it does. One of your notable past bands was called Two Apple Tobacco. I never heard this band though. I've only checked out the recordings. I didn't hear you play live with them.
Yes,
in that
Two
era.
Apple Tobacco. That was a big. That was my main avenue for. That was my main band for years, and a main avenue for kind of creation. A band with a bunch of friends, and we're still not dead. We're just sort of on like a little bit of a weird, cryo freeze or whatever kind of thing at the moment. And I keep trying to plan a nice reunion. We've actually got a third album that's mastered and ready for release, and our second album was never really properly released, so we kind of released an EP, and then but if you go onto Bandcamp, there's a whole second album there.
Is that Squinter's Paradise?
Yeah, that's called Squinter's Paradise. That album was, if anyone's a Pink Floyd fan, that was our singer and flautist at the time had never heard Dark Side of the Moon, and so it was just one of those things where some people were like, well, we got to sit down and listen to this. And when the Great Gig in the Sky came on with the sort of like super famous, vocals, it was sort of solo. Basically, there was, anyway, it was a strange conversation that came up of like, oh man, I was like, because I wanted a vocal solo. I was like, it's got to be like Great Gig in the Sky, and she was like, I've never heard that. I was like, okay.
Oh.
And then it was like, okay, well, I can't really do that, at least not without squinting. I guess you'll have to write a song about squinting. So then I was like, well,
okay.
okay, what I'll do is I'll write a whole freaking rock opera about squinting. How about that? And it's basically like we called it a pan-apocalyptic fantasia was the kind of subtitle we had for it. But it's basically a kind of like absurd story of like a kind of post, climate change destruction of the world where all the sea levels have risen and all the communities have to flee to the interior, but all that's left in the interior is like super burnt, way overly sunny, kind of like, horrible desertness type of thing. And so all the locals that live in that part of the area, they basically have to squint all the time because there's just like so much sunlight and no shade kind of thing. And as a result, their face muscles have actually like deformed and genetically started to alter, and that they're like always kind of like squinting, which makes them look like they're always kind of smiling in this way. So when you walk into town, they kind of greet you and they're always kind of smiling or whatever. But it's really not a smile. It's actually a very sinister place. They just kind of, their muscles have evolved that way because they live in the post-apocalyptic desert. And then you get the corporate rough riders who still live in the only sort of gated green communities who hunt these people for sport with their helicopters. And then you get the fact that the animal kingdom has risen up by this point against humanity, and basically like the smarter animals of the bunch, namely the elephants and the crows of the world, have turned on the humans and will launch these regular kind of blitzkrieg attacks on the human settlements. And that's basically the premise of the story. So it's an 8-song. It was supposed to be like, right, all of these like indie rock bands, you play a 45-minute set, right? So the idea was, okay, we're going to tell a story in 45 minutes. It's 8 songs, 45 minutes, kind of rock opera. So yeah, that's Squinter's Paradise.
It's the only album I've ever heard where track 1 has a skit about disaster insurance.
Yeah, that's right. A skit about disaster insurance is totally right. That's funny. But there is a tune on there that I brought back with the Daniel Deorksen band called Pure Ridiculousness.
I played it, Pure Ridiculousness. Yeah, I played it with you.
Yeah, that's right. We did play that one. Yeah, because that's where I needed Gabe to do the
violin.
The duo violin with me, which Isaac's been doing recently. Yeah. And that's one of my favorite things to bring up with the Dan Deorksen band these days, because Thomas Holden, who obviously we both work with a lot and know well, wrote some, embellished the horn arrangements on that really wonderfully. And so that tune, in my opinion, has never sounded better than it does these days when we put it on live.
Yeah. Yeah. You have like such a command of your own material, and that might sound like trivial to you, like of course I do, like it's my songs, it's my stuff, but sometimes you see people who they put out their own stuff and they're very kind of sheepish about it, and they don't want to just to stick their head up and say anything about it or to talk about the story behind it or anything. But you tell the story of your own music here and your own songs, and you craft them in such an epic way, but you also you embody and you deliver the story of it so well in such an epic way. And it like speaks to your multidisciplinary training, right? Like being an actor and being a musician, and you just own your material and you go all out on it. I love that.
Well, geez, thank you. I mean, that's quite a compliment. Well, I don't know what to say on that, except that like at this point I've conceded to the fact that this is just who I am and what I do. So when some harebrained crazy vision idea that I have makes it out into the world and I like it, like there's, I don't know, for me at least, there's no greater pleasure than that. It feels awesome to kind of smile and be like, wow, okay. Boom. Like that exists, and I like it at least. Hopefully other people will too,
Yeah. I think that's an awesome place to end it. We covered a lot of fun ground. Man, I want to thank you again for joining me on the show. I had a great time chatting with you.
Oh, totally. Yeah. I had a great time too.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of the Rhythm Changes podcast. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to become a member for free today at rhythmchanges.ca. Sign up. You'll get the free weekly email from me. We'll keep rolling. I'll write to you every Tuesday going into 2024. We will have new episodes of this show coming next year as well. I want to thank you for sticking around for any of the 80 episodes we have done so far. I can't wait to share some conversations with you next year. So until I talk to you again, have a great one.